I've been asked if I'd like to demonstrate some of my own games, and finally I've cracked, and I'm going to look at one game I lost and one game I won, and they're connected. The game I lost had a profound effect on my chess development, and I think led directly to the game I'm going to show you where I won. So without further ado, this first game was played in London in 1976 in a weekend tournament. Now in the 1970s, these weekend tournaments were incredibly popular. You played one game Friday night, 3 games Saturday, sometimes 2, but very often 3 games on Saturday, and then 2 games on the Sunday. And it's a grueling schedule because this wasn't blitz, this wasn't rapid chess. This was a reasonably sensible time control, usually with a rapid finish, something like, you know, they'd have 36 moves in an hour and a half, and then the rest of the game in 15 or 20 minutes, something like that. So, you know, not rapid, pretty sensible time control. And these weekend tournaments, obviously a tough schedule, but you gained so much experience very quickly. And they were very popular in England in the 1970s. So this was played in one of those tournaments. I was black, and I was ready with the good old Sveshnikov variation. So that would take place after this. And now e5. And this was just in its early stages of development in the late 70s, when, you know, you'd see these games from the Soviet Union played by Sveshnikov and Timoshenko and others, and it used to lead to really wild positions. I absolutely loved that with black, and I was ready. But my opponent scuppered my plans by playing bishop b5. Of course, a very sensible move if you think your opponent is ready with lots of theory. I knew a little something about this, but not very much. I played g6, which is, of course, one of the main moves. My opponent castled, and I played bishop g7 and c3. So with c3, I understood that my opponent wanted to play d4. Well, I didn't want him to build a big centre like that. So I thought to myself, fine, I can stop that. I'll play e5. And I knew that this was a very acceptable method of development. Putting the knight on e7, castles, d6, maybe even later going for f5. I thought this looked reasonable. But I was really shocked when my opponent played d4 anyway, just giving up a pawn. So this was very confusing for me, but, well, I took the pawn. You can play pawn takes here, but I thought, well, I'll play knight takes. You may as well simplify a little bit. And then bishop f4. Now suddenly I began to realise that things weren't so simple, because my opponent wants to station his bishop on d6. That could be very dangerous. So I thought to myself, well, what happened? I can't play d6, obviously, because there's a pin. So what happens if I push the bishop out of the way? Well, then the bishop comes to c4 and is looking at f7. And immediately white could probably attack that pawn. So I thought, don't like that. So, then I spotted queen b6. Perfect. Covering the d6 square, attacking the bishop, and you never know, there might be a chance to take on b2 supported by that bishop here. Well, that looked fine, so I blitzed that one out. And then my opponent played knight a3, and then I realized that I was in massive trouble. If a6, then just knight c4, attacking the queen, and if the queen takes bishop, then knight d6 forks king and queen. So this is already very, very difficult for black. The threat is knight c4 anyway, coming into d6, so queen f6. I thought, well, that attacks the bishop at least, and steps out of the way of the knight. So queen d2. So I thought I'd better get castled, so knight e7. But then came bishop g5. Very tricky indeed. This queen is on the move. I attacked it again. Sorry, I was attacked again. I wish I'd been playing white. And now knight b5. A really crude move, but a very strong move. If the knight is attacked, then queen f4 with a threat to take here, and obviously if castles, well, it could take on e7, but knight d6 is absolutely crushing. So there's a threat to take here, there's also a threat to take here as well, and black is utterly lost. I tried d5. I mean, this is an absolutely hopeless move, but anyway, I tried it. And bishop d7, and now my opponent sidestepped very nicely with queen e2, defending the knight, but also just putting more pressure here. Queen takes knight mate, obviously the threat. If black castles, if I'd castled, then bishop takes knight wins. I played f6, but d6 persuaded me that that really was enough. I resigned here after just 17 moves. An absolute disaster. Yeah, shocking loss. I remember not long after this, facing this position again, I'd done a bit of homework and I played knight f6, which is certainly the approved move, so that if e5, then the knight comes to d5. And actually, this isn't too bad for black at all, because you're ready to play d6. You can castle here first, but you can also play d6 to break up white's centre. But after knight f6, I remember my opponent played d4, sacrificing this pawn, another pawn sacrifice. I took it, but after d5, I was getting pushed around. And I don't think I still have the score of the game, but basically I got crushed in this variation as well. And that's when I realized, okay, this looks like a good system for white. I'm going to play it myself. The great advantage of this bishop b5 system is that you get castled extremely quickly. So you can see white's king is completely safe. White is ready to bring this rook into the game, into the attack, whereas black is basically still on his starting blocks on the king side. This is the problem. So white combines threats to establish a big centre with threats with this huge lead in development, at least a huge lead in development on the king side. And the combination of those two things, the development and trying to establish a big centre, it's actually quite tricky for black if you don't know what you're doing. Naturally, this is a very common opening system these days. But, well, as a 13-year-old, I was really at sea in this position. Theory wasn't very well established, and I certainly didn't have knowledge of it. And I'm afraid my greed took over in these positions, and I got punished. So as I said, I learnt a lot from this. The system is very dangerous, but also I learned not to be so greedy in the opening. Now, a few years later, let me just find the next game. Well, I started playing this system with black, and I had so many quick victories, very much in the same way that I'd lost games. But not just quick victories, actually. I had played some strong players and found that this was a very responsible system for white. Now, this game was played much later in 1988. in an open tournament that took place at the same time as the Olympiad in Thessaloniki in Greece. And I was playing a Yugoslav player. I seem to remember he was rated about 2200 or so, a little bit over 2200 I think. So a decent player, certainly much stronger than I was when I was 13. But look what happens to him. He played knight f6. Well, this is actually a pretty good move. g6 is the most common move, but knight f6 is not bad at all. The idea is to tempt white into playing e5, and you avoid all those tricky variations with c3 and d4. But I played knight c3, and that covers the d5 square. So that white, well, has, yeah, maybe e5 is a bit more unsettling now. But black can still play g6 here, and after this move, put the knight on g4. That's playable, actually. Anyway, my opponent played knight d4. So it's kind of exploiting the fact that this knight is on c3. I played e5. So that's a little bit awkward for the knight on f6, but this is actually an established variation, and black can get away with this by taking the bishop here and then putting the knight on d5. That's a slightly unusual position with this knight on b5. If black is allowed to settle here and develop properly, then this light squared bishop doesn't have an opponent, and eventually that will come into the game and could be very dangerous. So it's important here that white uses his lead in development. Remember, this is what I'd learnt from when I was a kid. So I played knight g5. Now, this is very unusual, very, very unusual. It's an incredibly tricky move. Basically, we're gunning for f7. It couldn't be more basic than that. It allows the queen into the game, perhaps coming out to these squares to attack f7, but also looking at the d5 knight. I'd never actually played this variation before this game, but I'd heard about it from people, I think. I'd never actually analysed it, but I knew that it was very tricky. I knew it was worth a go. So what happens? Let's look at the most obvious move, h6. Let's find out what the threat is. So h6 is not a great move, because then white can take on f7 and play queen f3 check. So that checks the king and also attacks the knight. Now, the king can stagger up the board to protect the knight, but this is absolutely awful. Let me just show you a little variation here. So, you know, white is already threatening to get a checkmate with d5, driving the king up the board. And after this, it's very hard for the king to escape, actually. So, for example, knight takes, and now g4. It's incredible. This is a really strong move, threatening queen d5, checkmate, and also threatening queen f5, checkmate. And after this, that is the end of that. Really bizarre. So h6, not a good move. What about a6, attacking the other knight? Well, then queen f3. And in this position, well, white is definitely better. Black's pawn structure certainly just doesn't look very attractive, and white is ahead in development as well. And what about e6? Well, then this knight swings back, and one of these knights is going to hop into d6, and things are looking great. You know, we can check the king, stop it casting. So my opponent played f6, was actually probably the best move in the position. And now queen f3 is a reasonable move. But I played instead knight e4. I discovered later this has actually been played by Tal before. And here, well, my opponent blundered straight away, but Tal's opponent, Umnatsakanyan, played in Yerevan 86, played f5, but Tal got a very nice position after this. In fact, I'm going to show you the whole game. Why not? A whole game that lasted 23 moves. Basically, white just has a big center and a big space advantage, and the queen is also extremely embarrassed in this position. It doesn't really have a very good square to go to. That d5 square isn't very good because there's going to be knight f4 hitting the queen. And now Tal played d5. This is a hideous position with this bishop on c8, absolutely dreadful. And if that's taken, then we're going to play knight f4 and capture on d5, dreadful. And now d6 is a really powerful move, but instead Tal took on e6 and played queen b3 because, well, we're just hitting this pawn. So we've got knight f4 coming, and if bishop here, then we're going to play, well, knight f4 is, well, I think this is actually an incredibly strong move. Rook c7. Tal's opponent played b5. But in this position, he resigned, which is pretty extraordinary, actually. Basically, this bishop is attacked. And there's also a threat. Well, to play rook c1. Basically, black just doesn't have good moves in this position. It's utterly lost. So 23 move victory for Tal. But my opponent didn't play f5. He played pawn takes pawn. And I gave a check. I took on e5. I mean, this is absolutely comical. Threatening the rook, threatening the knight, and also, more to the point, threatening knight, one of these knights to d6 and checkmate. My opponent played queen b6, which didn't really help that much, and after knight d6, he resigned. 11 moves. I still can't believe it. I think that's probably the shortest game I've ever won, I think, in serious chess. And as I said, this guy was rated over 2200. Well, if king d8, you can choose how you want to win, but queen takes rook is pretty good. Threatening queen takes bishop mate, and there really is no good defense. It's quite extraordinary. So there you can see I managed to use this opening that years before had caused me so many problems. And as I said, that the real things I learned from this opening, not just that it's a tricky opening, are that black's development on the king side is very, very poor compared to white's. And that's why this is such a dangerous system if black doesn't know what he's doing. I know there are many ways to play this for black, and very sound ways. Whoops, not king f1. But even so, strategically, this is actually quite a difficult position. And these kind of sacrifices with d4, for example, have rather gone out of fashion. But, well, I would recommend them. They're extremely dangerous. Nowadays, in this position, people take on c6. And this is a completely different way of playing the game because the structure has changed. But these old ways of playing for a quick d4, well, give them a try. Okay, maybe next time I'll show you another loss and another win. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think.